I collect signs of the times. Jesus talked about signs of the times, Matthew 16. He talked to the Pharisees and Sadducees about them. Back in the Old Testament, the sons of Issachar, in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, it talked about the sons of Issachar, the men of Issachar, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Well, I collect signs of the times. Here's one about an Amish home. Well, as a matter of fact, you know the Amish people make wonderful furniture, they make quilts, and then they sell them in a store. Some now have started to sell them inside their own home. You can go to the home and buy these materials, and now there's one Amish home that also accepts Visa. It's a sign of the times. Here's a new fax machine. It's a new fax machine to be used for confessions. New piece of technology unveiled at a church fair in Italy. It's not sanctioned by the Vatican, however, but it provides busy people the option of confessing the sins of lust, greed, and omission by fax machine. Here's another one. A busy mother invented a 5-day diaper. She says, I don't have time anymore, and the baby doesn't care. So, I mean, why not go the 5-day route? And so this diaper goes around the neck. You change it once every 5 days. She figures it saves her 9 hours a week. Here's another sign of the times here. This is by Tom Peters. Do you know Tom Peters? He's the best-selling business author in the history of the United States, probably the world. Wrote books like In Search of Excellence. He says excellence is a high-priced commodity. If you want to be excellent, and by the way, I believe in excellence. If you want to be excellent, you have to pay the price for that. And oftentimes that means late nights, oftentimes means weekends. It means you don't go to your daughter's soccer game. He's changed his tune a little bit, however, in this little article he wrote for Forbes magazine. Forbes says, would you write us an article? And he said, no. He said, well, I'll write you half a page. That's all I have time for. That's all I'm going to do. And this is what it says. Please, I just need some quiet time. He used to try to escape on a farm in Vermont, but he can't escape there anymore because he's got 6 computers and fax machines going nonstop. So he built a little house on Martha's Vineyard, a secluded part of Martha's Vineyard. The only way you can get there is rowing a boat across a bay. You beach the boat, you transfer your load to a 4-wheel drive vehicle that has deflated tires, and you kind of rumble on up to the house. The house is brand new. It doesn't have electricity. It doesn't have telephone connections. And this is what he says: the right to be left alone. The right to think. How I need to be A-W-A-Y, away, to have space, to reflect. The world is closing in on us, all of us, and I believe my #1 requirement is to get some space. Here's another one, exhausted. I don't know if you saw this a couple years back, Newsweek. They say there's an epidemic of exhaustion in American society. It's striking everybody indiscriminately. It doesn't make any difference how much money you make. It doesn't make any difference how much education you have. This is Harvard University president. He had to check himself into the hospital and take an emergency 3-month sabbatical. I don't know if you remember that. They say, we don't know why it's happening. We don't even know if it's true. It's just that everybody's talking about it all the time. It certainly was not predicted. The prediction of the past was that we'd all be bored right now, not exhausted. I'll talk about that in a second. They quote one mother of 4 from LaGrange, Illinois here. She says, I'm so tired, my idea of a vacation is a trip to the dentist. I just can't wait to sit in that chair and relax. They say, compared to the exhaustion of the past, you see, what you used to do in the 60s if you were really tired, you took a week's vacation in August and you went to a cabin and you sat in the cabin and there was no telephone, there's no electricity, and you slept in late and you read a novel, and at the end of the week you were okay. But it doesn't work anymore because when you get back and step on the treadmill, you're instantly tired again. A study out of Israel looked at exactly that, and people who were burned out and took a vacation, when they came back from the vacation after 3 weeks, they were burned out again. The message to me behind that is somehow we have to learn the secret of renewal on an ongoing basis. You can't store up all your needs for like one shot once a summer. Is this real, or is it a figment of our imagination? In medicine, we think about those things all the time. I was just in Boston. A guy came up to me and says, you know the hamster on an exercise wheel? I feel like the hamster on the exercise wheel, except the hamster's dead and the wheel's still going around. Another guy says, somebody took the lid off the blender of my life. Another person says, I'm too busy. I said, why is that? He said, my accrued vacation time exceeds my actuarial life expectancy. One lady, she went to different corporations teaching them about time management and organizational flow, and she quit her job. She ended up quitting her job. You know what made her quit? She found herself screaming at the microwave because it took 60 seconds to heat her coffee. She says, I don't have anything to teach anybody. I better figure it out myself. So she quit, she studied, she relaxed a little bit, and she wrote a book, Stop Screaming at the Microwave. There's a futurist in Milwaukee who says we're hyper-living, we're skimming along on the surface of life. As an editorialist says that American culture is strapped to a rocket, the range and velocity of which we can't even begin to guess. Max Lucado says America is the only nation in the world with a mountain named Rushmore. Is it true or is it not true? Some people say it is just a figment of our imagination. It is not true. It's not objectively provable. We're just wimps. Everybody just has no fortitude left compared to the people of the past. And yet other people say, no, this is a very difficult problem and it's very real. Let me give you some factoids, some statistics, some signs and symptoms. 30 million American men describe their lives as being stressed out. I don't know what the figure is for women, but those guys are married. It's 30 million women, too. 36% of Americans say they are rushed all the time. All the time. The average office worker is interrupted 202 times a day. The average desk worker has 36 hours of work piled on their desk and spends 3 hours a week shuffling piles, trying to find the project they're supposed to work on next. We spend 8 months of our lives opening junk mail. 1 year of our lives searching through the clutter on our desk looking for misplaced objects. The average misplaced object travels 10 inches. We spend 2 years trying to call people who aren't in or whose line is busy. The average American gets 2.5 hours less sleep than 100 years ago. In 1850, people got 9.5 hours of sleep a night. And what was invented after 1850? Electricity and a light bulb. It invaded the night. By 1910, we got 9 hours of sleep a night. By 1950, we got 8 hours. By 1990, we got 7 hours. It's still going down. 50 to 70 million Americans have sleep disorder problems. 27% of Americans fell asleep while driving last year. Migraine headaches are up 60% in the last decade. I can go on. The point is, you have to make the right diagnosis if you're ever going to solve the problem. And the other point is, this was not predicted by any of the futurists. And yet I'm making the assertion that this is real and it's after us. It's after the vitality of our relationships. It's after our spiritual well-being. There will be no prayer left. There will be no meditation left. There will be no one anothering within the church if this overload epidemic continues to go in the direction that it's going. The futurists in the 60s said that by now you'd have one wage earner per family working 20 hours a week. And that's all that you need, because progress in technology would go toward increasing productivity, and wages are tied to productivity. So productivity would go up, wages would go up, and we'd all be bored. That isn't what happened. I mean, if you only look at the work statistics, the average husband-wife unit is putting in 90 hours, not 20 hours. The prediction only missed by 350%. Other than that, it was a pretty good prediction. If you are going to solve this problem in your own life, in your family's life, in your church's life, for the sake of the kingdom of God, you have to diagnose it accurately first, because it is a firmly entrenched problem, and it is indeed real. One study said that 85% of Christians do all of their praying or most of their praying on the run. I'd like to talk a little bit about the math, but unfortunately we don't have time. But I'm giving an hour and a half talk in 30 minutes, so it's I'm going to condemn speed and overload, but doing both. If we were to graph these social changes, they would be exponential curves. It's very important to understand how dramatic exponentiality is under these kinds of conditions. Seldom do we realize the historic when we're living through it. And when things are changing this rapidly mathematically, it overwhelms our intuitive ability to follow it and to estimate where it's taking us. For example, if you took this piece of paper and folded it in half 40 times, it'd go from here to the moon. Your intuition didn't tell you that. You have to do the math to figure it out. If you fold it 100 times, it'd go to the far wall of the universe, 15 billion light years out there. That dwarfs our intuitive ability to figure out. And yet those are the conditions in which we are living today in terms of how dramatically this is changing. Now, what is causing all of this? This is coming largely because of progress. And if you want to jump to the defense of progress, I will jump with you to the defense of progress. What is progress, by the way? Progress is the notion that life automatically improves. That's a good thing. We should have progress. We should work to make life better. Progress works largely by differentiation. Nicholas Wolterstorff, in his book Until Justice and Peace Embrace, quotes a Dutch economist and talks about differentiating our environment. Normal biblical activity. I think it's what Genesis is talking about. So how do you differentiate? If you give progress a chainsaw and say, cut down that tree and differentiate it, it would make podiums, and it would make fruit bowls and baseball bats and wooden forks. If you were to give progress a tablecloth and say differentiate that, it would make gloves and hats and shirts and socks. Progress is very good at differentiation. As a result of that, progress always leads to more. It always leads to more. Progress cannot lead to less and less, slower and slower. It always leads to more and more of everything faster and faster. This is what the futurists forgot to factor in. More and more of everything faster and faster, often at exponential rates. Now, I've got a problem here. Number one, I like more. That's the American definition of happiness, is more than I have now. So, I mean, there's no real problem with progress or differentiation or more. But I do have a problem all of a sudden when you stop to realize that humans have limits. I only have a 24-hour day. I only have a 24-hour day. Progress cannot afford to pay any attention whatsoever to the fact that I have limits. It has to continue differentiating. If it stopped, our economy would fall apart. That does not have bipartisan support. So progress has to continue doing exactly what it's doing, but meanwhile it is propelling me right into my own personal limits. As a result of that, progress always leads, axiomatically leads, to increasing stress and change and complexity and speed and intensity and overload. Let me just look at these one at a time just for a minute. Stress. What is stress? You know, we use the word almost on a daily basis, but we're not very good at defining exactly what it is. Is stress a bad word? Stress is not a bad word. You know, as a matter of fact, I think God himself created the stress mechanism. Stress is the human physiology's adaptation to change. When any change comes into your environment, you have to adapt to that. God made us, he created us very adaptable. As a matter of fact, we like to have that adaptational mechanism triggered. That's normal living. That's normal biblical living. It's an appropriate thing. It doesn't make any difference if it's small change, large change, good change, bad change. It's all stress because you're adapting to that. Now, if I were to give you a stress-free life, would you want that? You literally would die. You literally would die. It turns out you have to have change and challenge and novelty in our life even to survive. How about a low-stress life then? Okay, you don't want no stress. How about a low-stress life? We've done studies. We put people in a high-stress life and in a low-stress life. People prefer the high-stress life. They have a name for the low-stress life. Do you know what that is? Boring, boring. I can't stand that word, but, you know, adults don't like boring either. It's just been 20 years since they've been there, so they don't remember that they don't like it. But teenagers use that word quite a bit. So you don't want a stress-free life, you don't want a low-stress life, but neither do you want a hyper-stress life. And right now we are triggering that adaptational mechanism too much, and people are becoming sick as a result of it. I was speaking to members of Congress, the House of Representatives. Somebody says, what are some symptoms of stress? I gave about 15 of them: physical symptoms, behavioral symptoms, emotional symptoms. And then a congressperson sitting right next to me said, what does it mean if you have all of those? There was a nervous laughter in the room, but I think they all had all of them. The guy from Philadelphia gave me this, how to handle stress. Here's a couple suggestions. There's 12 of them here. I'll give you a couple of them. One is drive to work in reverse. One is fill out your tax forms in Roman numerals. I'm seriously thinking about that, but it would trigger an audit. I know it would trigger an audit. Another one is stare at people through the tongs of a fork and pretend they are in jail. Okay, so progress leads to more stress. It axiomatically leads to more stress. And you don't want no stress or low stress, but you don't want hyper stress. Progress. The second thing is change. There's been more change from 1900 to the present than in all recorded history prior to 1900. There is no deceleration in sight. Ray Kurzweil, who's a science futurist, says in the next 100 years, we're going to go through 20,000 years of progress. Change is out of control, as a matter of fact. God doesn't mind change, but too much change is too much change. Did you read that the Greek drachma, which is the coin in Greece and has been there for 2,650 years, it's finally giving way to the euro. It's dropping out of sight. The next thing after change is complexity. Progress axiomatically leads to increasing complexity. Some things in life are simple, some are complex, but the curve is always shifting toward the complexity side. The engineers at this school understand, I mean, you're going to make an entire living out of making things more complex. Actually, any engineer can make something more complicated. That is not hard. That's going with the flow. As a matter of fact, it's very simple to make something more complicated. It takes a genius, dedicated effort to make something simple. Very, very difficult to do, to go against the flow there. The average American has to learn how to operate 20,000 pieces of technology in our lifetime. 3/4 of them are designed to infuriate. I have a physics degree. I don't know how to set my watch. It took me 6 months to figure out how to use the copy machine in our clinic. There was a sign on top of the copy machine at our university library that says, "Use at your own risk." United Airlines flies 777s, a beautiful airplane, and they are now sending a full-time mechanic on every flight to teach the first-class passengers how to use their seats. Complexity. A.W. Tozier said, see, what would God think about hyperstress? What does God think about change out of control? What about complexity? A.W. Tozier says, very seldom do we see in our midst today the simplicity of the gospel message. It's so understandable, isn't it? God just saying, I love you. I don't hold your sins against you. Won't you let me rescue you? It is so simple. Complexity. The next thing is speed. There's an automatically advancing speed rheostat on the world, and every year it seems like things have ratcheted up another 5%. I don't have any problem with going fast. I don't have any problem with going faster. I have a problem with going too fast. When you cross the line and you go too fast, bad things start to happen. You start to get sick. You start to perspire. You start to make mistakes. You start to yell at your friends. And we all need to be careful about that. Jesus never ran. The Bible doesn't say anything about Jesus running. James Thurber says, man is flying too fast for a world that is round. Soon he will catch up with himself in a great rear-end collision. Somebody asked Henry Blackaby, how did you get done all the things that you've accomplished in life? And he said, you know, Henry Blackaby, the Experiencing God author, and this is what he said. He said, I spent my whole life hurrying God. You ever hurry God? He says, I spent my whole life hurrying God. I was running around doing all these things, and somehow God had to fit into it all. And then one day God said to me, Henry, you're not going to hurry me anymore. You are going to have to fit in to my schedule. And Blackaby says it changed everything. It changed everything. I want to read from you. There's 450 English language versions of the Bible. I want to read. This is a new one, just came out. Linda just gave it to me for Christmas. It's Good News for the Busy Man, the accelerated version. I want to read Psalm 23 for you here. Lord's my shepherd, I shall not make the green pasture, leave me in the sons of the storms, he guides me in the paths of evil, walk the shadows of the fear, no evil, rather says they come to me, protect me in the presence of my enemy, you know myself, I come sure to go off to all the adults off forever. You see, I got my devotions down 34% from what it used to take. I know people that takes them 3 or 4 months to get through Romans. I can get through Romans start to finish in 14 minutes. Which version do we read out of? The problem is we're all running, but God's not running after us. He knows speed doesn't yield devotion. I think I would be not far wrong if I were to postulate our sense of the presence of God is in inverse proportion to the pace of our lives. Meditation, wisdom, worship are slow and mellow and deep. And the next thing I want to talk about is overload. This is kind of the mother problem of all of the other problems. Do you have a theology of human limits? Do we have limits? Yeah, well, we have limits, that's true. Well, where do they come from? You know, there's been very little science and there's been very little theology that have looked at this in any kind of rigorous way whatsoever. And yet we need to. Increasingly, it's a desperate hour for examining what this means, the practical implications in our life. The fact that I have limits is not a threat to God at all. Let me repeat that. The fact that I have limits is not a threat to God at all. It was his idea. He built them in. He didn't want competition with the job of being God. He does a pretty good job of running the universe. He didn't need my help. So he made me the creature. I'm the one that has limits. He put in the 24-hour day, and he says, you're not going to get an extra 5 seconds no matter how much you beg. So if God had the idea of putting limits in me, if I'm the finite one, then it's probably okay with God if I have limits. He probably regards it as a little bit strange when I pretend, indeed, that they don't exist. There are no exemptions to this. Let me repeat that. There are no exemptions to this. I talk to a lot of hyperstoical people, neurosurgeons, cardiovascular surgeons. I've been to the Pentagon multiple times, pre-selected for hyperstoicism. There are no exemptions to the issues of human limits. Where we draw that line, that threshold of human limits is drawn in a different place for different people, because some people are 10 times more productive than I am. So I would have to go way out through that wall into the street and across the field, but I can find the line and I can draw the line. And once you drift across that line, bad things reliably start to happen to your life, including to your spiritual life. You know, if in your theology you say, I want to do all I can for God, that sounds great. As a matter of fact, it sounds very laudatory. I'm sympathetic very much to that. But if that is your theology, you will fail it every single day of your entire life. Whenever you end the day, it is an arbitrary ending place. There is always something more that you could do. Even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you could pray a little more. You could write a letter of encouragement to somebody. You and I could go downtown and to a bar. There's probably some despairing old soul sitting there, and we could witness to that person. And so if we feel we have to pay God back, we will fail in our own theology virtually every single day. So work is enormously important. I am not saying that. I am not suggesting that we should have a life of idleness and laziness. But there is grace and there is rest. Fortunately for all of us, God breaks into our work and he says, okay, Dick, good job. Now it's time to sleep. Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on the universe. How about Philippians 4:13? What does that say? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Wonderful verse, exactly true. I'm glad it's in the Bible. But does that mean you can swim the Pacific Ocean? Does that mean you can go 6 months without sleeping? It doesn't, but the verse is not wrong. So we have to be careful not to misinterpret that verse and use it as a form of presumption. Instead of feeling threatened spiritually by the whole issue of human limits, I think that we almost offend God's creation wisdom when we pretend they're not there. Because the secret of building the kingdom never rested with me anyway. It's not the arm of flesh. It is the power of God working through me. And I'm sometimes tempted to forget that. What are some symptoms of overloading? Let's take a look. Chronic overloading, by the way, is an enemy of prayer. Chronic overloading is an enemy of worship, of meditation, of love, of caring, of one anothering, of service. What happens when we're chronically overloaded is we stop doing those things. We stop loving, we stop praying, we stop caring, we stop worshiping. Or perhaps what is even worse, we don't stop, but we start simply going through the motions. Have you pushed the button on autopilot and just gone through the motions? Doctors do this all the time. Doctors like to care for their patients, but there are times they do not have anything to give. And so they push the button and they go on autopilot and they see patients in an assembly line fashion, but there's no real service or compassion or caring left. Okay, what are the symptoms? Okay, this is the line, 100% line right there. And here I'm at 95%, and then I'm at 98%, and then I went to 102%. How did I know I just crossed that line? It's a very important question. There are multiple kinds of symptoms, and what you need to do is understand your own symptom complex. For me, 2 things happen. 1, I get irritable, and 2, I get migraine headaches. I am not an irritable person. I'm a mellow person. I like to enjoy life. I kind of laid back. When I start going ballistic right and left, it's because I'm overloaded. When I start getting migraine after migraine, it's because I'm overloaded. This thesis, I am not exempt from my own thesis. It happens to me all the time. Short-term overload happens to everybody. I mean, at tax time, it happens to people. During exams, it will happen to people. Short-term overloading is not the enemy. It's chronic overloading that drains you of any kind of spiritual reserves at all. Let me role play for you just a little bit. This is 80%, that's 100%, that's 120%. You're over here, you're a physician, and your colleague is on call. Your colleague comes up to you and says, could you take my call this weekend? We've got a family crisis. I got to go. My sister's having surgery. I think it's cancer. Could you take my call? And you say, sure, I'll take your call. I got some margin in my life here, this little space between my load and my limits, and I like you, and I hope your sister's okay. I'll take your call. And then they call from the soccer league in town, and they say the fourth grade soccer coach broke her leg. We're wondering if you could do that for like 2 or 3 months, coach those kids. And you say, that's great. Thanks for asking me. I need the exercise. I like the kids. I'll be glad to do that. Your spouse, if you happen to be married, says, let's take the neighbors out to dinner Friday night. They've lived next to us for 2 years. We don't even know what they look like. Let's have them over for dinner on Friday night. You say, let's do it. You get over here to 100%. Your coworker comes up to you and says, could you take my call this weekend? And you say, well, I'd like to, but I mean, I just don't, I don't know if I can, really. I mean, you should see our life. It's just crazy. We're so maxed out our schedule. My family would annihilate me if I took a commitment. And, boy, I hope your sister's okay. I'll let you know tomorrow. I'll tell you what, I'll do it. I don't know how I'll do it, but I'll do it. But just this once, okay? This is not precedent setting. And you walk away from there and say, what's happening to me? I always wanted to help people out. I don't even care about this person anymore. And they call from the soccer league and they say, could you coach the fourth grade soccer team? And you say, I'd love to, but I can't right now. Call me down the road when life gets better. You know, down the road when life gets better. And then your spouse says, how about taking the neighbors out to dinner on Friday night? And you say, let's do it next July, August, September. Maybe we can fit it in then. We can't do it this week. You get over here to 120%. And your colleague comes to you and says, could you take my call for me this weekend? I've got a family crisis. I need somebody to take my call. And you say, stop right there. I quit. I quit. I'm sick and tired of everybody dumping their load in my desk, expecting me to bail them out at the last minute. It happens every day, every week, every month, every year for as long as I've been here. I've had it up here. Where's the door? Because I'm out of here. They call from the soccer league. They say, could you coach the fourth grade kids? And you say, I hate kids. I hate kids. And you're an idiot. Who gave you my number anyway? Don't you ever call me again. And then your spouse says, how about taking the neighbors out to dinner on Friday night? And you say, you can do whatever you want. This is what I'm doing. I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm coming home at 5:30. I'm going to close the door. I'm going to lock the door. I'm going to deadbolt the door. I'm turning off the lights. I'm closing the curtains. I'm pushing the refrigerator and the television next to the bed. I'm going to bed. I'm not getting up till Monday morning. On the way home tonight from work, I'm buying a commode. I'm not getting out of bed. So we have 3 scenarios here. What changed in these 3 scenarios? The thing asked of you? No, the thing asked of you was precisely the same in all 3 situations. In which of these 3 situations were you a better advertisement for the things of God? What is it like to be a physician over here, chronically 120, 130% overloaded? You go into medical school to help people with their problems, and you spend your entire professional career resenting people for needing your help because you feel sicker than they are. You say, I don't care if your ulcer's bleeding. Deal with it. Go home and deal with it. Can you see the practical implications of a life of service and caring and love? Our relationships at home, our love in one another within the church, our direct connection with God in terms of meditation, in terms of any kind of devotional response of the heart. Well, I'm suggesting that we need some margin. The space between our load and our limits. It has to do with our reserves. It's a place where we rest, where we recharge our batteries, where we recover our passion, where we nourish our relationships, where we be still and know that He is God. Marginlessness is the doorbell ringing, the phone ringing, the kids fighting, the baby crying, you're trying to get ready for a meeting that started 10 minutes ago. Car's out of gas, you can't find your wallet, you sprained your ankle, you get a migraine headache. I can go on. That's marginlessness, and it is toxic to the kingdom. Henry Nouwen has written this. In the spiritual life, the word discipline means the effort to create some space in which God can act. Discipline means to prevent everything in your life from being filled up. Discipline means that somewhere you're not occupied and certainly not preoccupied. In the spiritual life, discipline means to create that space in which something can happen that you hadn't planned or counted on. God's asking us to walk the second mile, to carry others' burdens, to witness to the truth at any opportunity, and to teach our children when we sit, walk, lie, and stand, all presuppose that we have margin and that we make it available for His purposes. You know, the thing that really set me free in this was Jesus Himself, the example of Christ. What would Jesus have done with beepers and cell phones? Can you imagine halfway through the Sermon on the Mount his cell phone goes off? Imagine him getting beeped out of the Last Supper. It's really interesting to stop and think about it. I mean, I'm not saying let's throw all the technology over the cliff, but I mean, what would He do? I thought about the life of Christ, and I said to myself, what is ministry for Jesus? You know the answer? The person who's standing in front of Him. The person who's standing in front of me is an obstacle. I'm trying to get over, under, around, or through because I'm late down the road. And yet for Jesus, it was the person standing in front of Him. You know, Jesus did not heal every case of leprosy in Israel. Stop and think about that. If you could just look at it or touch it and heal it, wouldn't you hold clinic till 3 o'clock every morning? You know, give the disciples like an hour and a half sleep every night and just keep running from village to village. He didn't do that. But you know what who He did heal? The person standing in front of Him. He knew there's going to be more leprosy tomorrow. He didn't visit everybody, He didn't teach everybody, but He visited and taught the person standing in front of Him at the time. And I think about how completely contrary that is to the way my whole mentality about having agendas and about being late for my appointment down the road. Just in case we missed the personal illustration, then he told us the following story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of thieves. You know it. You know it well. Luke 10, from verse 25 to 42. Read that section. Read it again and again and again. Might I suggest to us all that if we don't carefully avoid the oftentimes malignant effects of the overload syndrome, we will largely be uninterested in the story of the Good Samaritan. They did an interesting study. It's reported in The Tipping Point, a fairly new book. 2 Princeton University psychologists, they decided to do a study based on the biblical story of the Good Samaritan. This is what they did. They met with a group of seminarians from Princeton Theological Seminary. They met with them individually. They asked each one to prepare a short extemporaneous talk on a biblical theme, and then to walk over to a different building and present their talk there. Along the way, as they were going to present their talk, they were to come upon, unbeknownst to them, a person lying in an alley, stooped over with eyes closed, groaning and coughing. And then the study was going to see what kind of response that these seminary students would have for this person who was in need. They introduced 3 variables. First, they gave the students a questionnaire about why they'd chosen theology. In other words, they said, did you choose theology because you wanted to have an intellectual and philosophical reflective life and you found it interesting, or because you really wanted to help individuals, you really wanted to serve people? The second thing, not that the two are mutually exclusive. The second thing is they varied the theme. They varied the theme that they asked these students to talk about. In other words, this extemporaneous talk. Some of them were given the theme of the Good Samaritan, and others were given other themes. Okay? And then the third variable is they gave them different instructions. For one group of students, the experimenter said this. He looked at his watch and says, "Oh, you're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago. We better get moving." To the other group of seminarians, the experimenter would say, "It'll be a few minutes before they're ready for you, but you might as well head over now." Now, most of us in this experiment would think that those students who went into seminary in order to be of service to their fellow man, or those students who were preparing to talk on the Good Samaritan, those would be the people who would stop and help this person that they encountered. But the fact of the matter is, even some of those that were in this for just read about the Good Samaritan stepped right over the man and did not stop at all. The only people that stopped were those who had a little bit of time in their schedule. 10% of the first group stopped, but 63% of those that had a little bit of time in their schedule stopped. Availability, interruptibility. Are we really willing to let God Almighty himself control our agendas? Redirect us at a moment's notice. To be sure, let's make our plans, let's arrange our schedules, let's develop our agendas, but we must always hold our agendas humbly and lightly, realizing that God Almighty has the right to redirect us. In the end, what can we say? We can say that it's not about success or wealth or fame. It's not about MD degrees or PhD degrees or MBAs. It's not about Cedarville College. It's not about the state lectureship series. It's certainly not about Richard A. Swenson, MD. It's not about hastiness. It's not about superficiality. It's not about busyness and schedules, and it's not about margin. It's about seeking first the kingdom of God. It's about love. In the end, it's all about Christ. Let's pray. As hard as it is, Father, examine our hearts. Help us to reorder our priorities. And help us to walk with integrity, uprightly, a life of love and service as you ordain. In Jesus' name.